I've just seen an update on the case of the two Michaels. So this is the case of two Canadian citizens who have been imprisoned in China on charges of spying. And there's an update on this. I've mentioned this case before, but this is an update. So I'll just read out the first few paragraphs of the BBC article, and I'll put a link to that as always. I won't read out the whole article; it's quite long, but this is the first few paragraphs, and the report is doesn't say who the report's by. China has charged two Canadians with spying more than 18 months after they were detained. Michael Kovrig, a former diplomat, and Michael Spavor, a businessman, have been held in China since December 2018. Their arrest came just days after Meng Wanzhou, an executive of the Chinese giant Huawei, was detained in Vancouver at the request of the US. Canada called the arrests arbitrary, but China denies they were retaliation for Miss Meng's decision. That's BS, quite clearly. Both men have been charged with spying on national secrets and providing intelligence for outside entities. China's court system is completely controlled by the Communist Party and has an almost 100% conviction rate once defendants are charged, notes the BBC's Stephen McDonnell in Beijing. Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei and daughter of the company's founder, was arrested on the 1st of December 2018 in Vancouver. Her arrest was requested by the United States, who accused her of breaking Iranian sanctions. She's still fighting extradition to the United States, so she's being held in Vancouver at the moment. On the 10th of December, the Canadians were detained in China. They were formally arrested in May 2019, after which they had just had 13 and a half months to be charged. In September, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau accused China of using arbitrary detention as a tool to achieve political goals. Michael Kovrig's employer, the crisis group think tank, says on its website that he has not seen a lawyer or his family since the detention, and that he has only had periodic consular visits. Michael's work has included meeting Chinese officials, academics, and analysts from multiple Chinese state institutions, the crisis group said. He has attended numerous conferences on the invitation of Chinese organizations. He frequently appears on Chinese television and in other media to comment on regional issues. Nothing Michael does has harmed China. The Free Michael Spavor website, updated earlier this year, said he was behind bars, without his family and without access to lawyers. Michael is an earnest, genuine, and impossibly fun person who we believe has been paid in error, the website says. In April 2019, it was reported that both men were being interrogated for between 6 to 8 hours a day and were sometimes subject to 24-hour artificial lighting, which can be seen actually as a form of torture. It includes sleep deprivation. The Chinese government says the men are in good health. I could read on, but I'll read one more paragraph. Um, Though the Chinese government has not absolutely explicitly linked the cases of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig with Meng Wanzhou's extradition proceedings in Vancouver, it's certainly given large dollops of nudge, nudge, wink, wink references making this connection. Right. Let me just say, I think absolutely there's a connection. It's irrefutable. The fact that both cases absolutely coincided with one another, the idea that it's just coincidental that a Chinese national, a senior businesswoman, is arrested in Vancouver on charges of violating sanctions via her company, and then Canadians are arrested in China very shortly afterwards. It just seemed too much of a coincidence to be a coincidence. So I absolutely don't believe that. I think it's disgusting how these men are being used as pawns. I would go so far as to say they're basically hostages of the Chinese state. And it's a stark contrast. Those Chinese nationalists who were out protesting for Meng Wanzhou, they should look at how these Canadians are being treated, and then, talk about justice. Look at how the two cases compare. Meng Wanzhou has been under house arrest in Vancouver. However, she has had full access to a lawyer. She's had full access to her legal rights, to due process, to her family. She has had protesters protesting on her behalf, and she gets to live in a luxury apartment in Vancouver. Contrast that to the ordeal these two men have went through. No contact with their families, minimal consular assistance because China won't allow it. Um, and no charges until now. or rather, no access to lawyers. It's absolutely repugnant. And the difficult thing with something like this is the right thing to do, the morally right thing to do would be for Ottawa to take a very hard line and expel the Chinese ambassador and, really, really make a big thing out of it. Unfortunately, any government in this position, no matter how powerful, including the American government, even the United States has to tread carefully in these sort of situations, as we've seen from American citizens held in North Korea. Um, Unfortunately, if Ottawa is too robust in its criticism, as justified as that is, the Chinese will just increase the sentence. They'll just make things even harder. The most important thing right now for the Canadian government is getting these men home. And I can't imagine the ordeal that their families are going through. Um, of course, what they are going through, but particularly the families. They're in a profession where they know that this is probably a possibility. I'm sure they're tough, but they must be very worried about what their families are going through on their behalf as well. I mean, I try to think of myself in that situation if I was, arrested in a foreign country under false charges, how would I respond? I mean, so much of it is beyond your control. That's the scary thing. So much of it is beyond your control. Just watch out. Watch out for this trial. No doubt China will get them to make a confession. It will be a forced confession. CGTN will film it. Um, I really think that when these guys eventually get released, and it's possible that it's possible there will be some sort of deal. Incidentally, I do think that Canada's foremost responsibility is to its own citizens, not to the United States. So it may be that there needs to be some sort of exchange here. Um, whilst Miss Meng may or may not be guilty, and I know the Americans wouldn't be happy about that, they want to see her face justice. The United States also needs to consider the Canadian position. This is their nationals involved, and the Americans need to absolutely appreciate the position that Ottawa is in. So it's all very well saying, she's violated these sanctions and we want to extradite her. But, Washington must know that's going to put them in more trouble. And surely it would be a gesture to an allied country, notwithstanding Trump's rants against allies. Surely it would be a good gesture to say, okay, this is one situation where we may need to just back down a little bit for the sake of our ally, um, on humanitarian grounds. We'll do a prisoner exchange. Meng Wanzhou will get to go back to China on the absolute condition that these men are released without any caveat, without any charge, absolutely released and returned to Canada. I think as a humanitarian point that should be considered. I don't know if Trudeau has considered that. But may get to a point where there's no other way. It may be the only way to get these men out. If that means Meng Wanzhou avoiding her trial, it may be necessary. Um, but this is what needs to be understood. These guys are Canadians, but they could very easily be New Zealanders, Dutch, Australian, American for that matter. They could be British, they could be French, they could be Japanese, they could be Vietnamese, they could be any outsiders, because this is how the thug regime in Beijing works. Their insistence that it's got nothing to do with the Meng Wanzhou case is a lie. I don't know how they can say that with a straight face and think that people will believe it. It's clearly retaliation. Now, my answer to that is if they really do believe these men are guilty of spying, okay, put them on trial, prove it, show the evidence, prove it without a reasonable doubt. But because the Chinese justice system is filthy with corruption because it's controlled by the lying Communist Party, then they've already determined that they're guilty. It doesn't matter that they have been charged and they're awaiting trial. The Chinese Communist regime has already decided these men are guilty. Um, and I find that absolutely disgraceful. When the Salisbury poisoning happened in the UK, those two Russian suspects were not arbitrarily detained in Britain without trial. Um, that's the difference between how our systems work and how China works. And it's just another example of this thuggish way of them trying to assert the Chinese state trying to assert its pride and its ego. And actually, I think this points to a very, very fragile regime, a very insecure regime, because a regime that has to be so cruel and so um, manipulative in the way it deals with international relations is one that is clearly insecure. When these men are finally released, that is the most important thing from the Canadian perspective. I think we should not be sitting on the fence. I'd like to know why Johnson is silent. I'd like to know why our government is silent on this. I mean, we don't have any nationals detained, as far as I know, in China right now, so it's not like we have to be careful for their sake. As far as I know, we don't. There may be people up for drug offences or other offences, but not this sort of geopolitical situation. So, unfortunately, this is how the regime in Beijing works. You stand up to them, then they take your citizens hostage. Um, they've presented no evidence whatsoever as to the guilt of these men, none. And I do think the Canadian government has a right to be demanding that evidence. I think, I've mentioned Ottawa needs to tread carefully. Any government institution does. It's a bit like terrorists taking hostages. One could argue the Chinese state is a terrorist state. But anyway, the way, yeah, so they do need to tread carefully, but at some point that caution also um, needs to be tempered with bluntly saying, we can see what you're doing here. We can see that you're using our citizens as a pawn, and we demand that you provide evidence for this. We we demand that you treat them fairly. And it would have to be like, we're not telling you how to run your legal system, but if I were the Canadians, I would be actually talking about the contrast. I wouldn't be shying away from that, because that will shame the Chinese state into getting on the defensive, and then maybe they'll ease up a little bit and be a bit more humane in the treatment of these men. It might give them access to their families on the phone. I think it's disgusting, and it should be. I think it should also be a reminder, not just for governments, but for anybody. Anybody, if you are in business, if you are in the diplomatic service, if you are anything to do with that, and you go to China, you need to be aware that this could happen to you. I worked in China twice, but I was just an English teacher. I wasn't they would never be able to put that on me because I'm not important enough. Now, if you're a business person or you're working in some sort of consultation or anything like that, you could be a target. So China's not a dangerous country in terms of it doesn't have particularly high crime, and it's obviously not a war zone, but it's dangerous insofar as the thuggish tactics of its government. And I really think that the case of the two Michaels needs to just make people think about investing in China and working there. I'm not talking about as an English teacher. I think that's a different. I had mostly a good experience, but it just shows that this can affect anyone. Yes, they come from the sort of background where they're more likely to be a target, but the Chinese state show no evidence. If they really do have evidence for this, provided that isn't made up evidence, um, I also think it's absolutely disgraceful. I finally got around to sending that message to Ofcom the other day. I'm going to check my emails after this, see if they've responded about CGTN operating in the UK. I think it's repugnant that they still have a license. I don't know if CGTN has a branch in Canada, but um, if some sort of trial goes ahead and these men confess, um, then I really think Canada would have a right to retaliate. Um, at that point, it would be beyond sort of saying, "Oh, let's be careful in case they make the sentence worse," because the sentence will already be probably pretty harsh. Um, Probably not life, but I don't know what the sentence would be, but it would be. I mean, certainly they have the death penalty for drug offences. So if that's for drug offences, it makes you wonder what would be the penalty for a foreign spy. Um, this is not to say that there aren't Western spy agencies that are probably are working covertly against China. That's that's what espionage is. Every country does it. China certainly does it. So yes, there will be Western operatives probably working um, to get Chinese intelligence, but they need to prove it. The onus is on Beijing to prove this. And right now, it just looks like petty revenge and callous revenge due to the case of Meng Wanzhou, even though she's been treated far, far better than these guys have. And that should also be a reminder to those little nationalists that want to gather in Vancouver and demand her release. These spoilt brats who get to study in Canada, um, need to really be reminded that, uh, you know, enjoying Western freedom doesn't mean you get to insult your host nation. And it doesn't mean you get to make phony analogies or indeed ignore those analogies. Um, it just points to the fact that Canada is a much fairer country than China is, whatever way you look at it. I mean, I feel strongly about this. As far as I'm concerned, they could both be British. Canada's our sister nation, a country with very similar values, shared history. We absolutely should not be sitting on the fence here. Goodness knows we've enough issues of our own with China. And I still think the language from British politicians is far too cautious. It's all about, oh, we're not anti-China. We're not. Look, the point has come where we need to stop using flowery language. We need to just talk robustly, because that's the only language bullies understand. And right now, the Chinese government is run by bullies who think they can throw their weight around the world and do as they please. And I think the only way there's any chance of that turning around on some level, of the Chinese regime backing down a little bit, is if more and more countries do the right thing and stand up to them. It's the only way. Because the more weakness that we show to China, the more emboldened they will be. I really believe that. And I really feel really bad for these guys. My gut feeling is they're innocent. If they are guilty, then it would be, if China can conclusively prove that they have been trying to gather intelligence on the Chinese military or something, then, if it is absolutely solid, cast iron, then it would be difficult, to argue against that because, well, they've been caught and they're guilty. But because of the nature of the Chinese justice system, it's flawed from the start. So even if they're found guilty, it will almost certainly be via forced confession, not evidence. And we need to be loudly and clearly saying it's not evidence. I'm just sick and tired of this idea that we need to be cautious with the Chinese regime. We need to stand up to them. It's all we need to do right now.